Welcome to yet another session of CAT RC practice by Rhoda. I'm so sorry I was missing in action for the last 4 or 5 days, but I'll try to come down with regularity here. So let's read this. As I said, I will be putting this RC in the drive link and the WhatsApp link will be shared in the description box. So let's read this. Experts anticipate that global atmospheric concentration of CO2 will have doubled by the end of the 21st century. Fair enough? So I think I'm talking about experts. So this becomes one of my scope, this becomes my tone, and I'm talking about concentration of carbon dioxide to be have doubled. It is known that CO2 can contribute to global warming by tapping solar energy that is being re-radiated as heat from the Earth's surface. So adding more context here, what I'll do is adding more context to the increased CO2. However, now this I've told you, right, it's an idea alteration, pretty important keyword. Some research has suggested that elevated CO2 levels could enhance the photosynthetic rates of plants, resulting in a lush world of agricultural abundance, and that the CO2 fertilization effect, because we're trying to grow CO2, so they've named this as CO2 fertilization, might eventually decrease the rate of global warming. So when you are increasing CO2, this will keep on increasing. They're saying CO2 fertilization will happen, and they're saying eventually what will happen here is the global warming would go down. But this is quite the contrary to what we have been fed around. But remember, we go by the evidences given in the passage. So if this is given, we assume this as true. The increased vegetation in such an environment could be counted on to draw more CO2 from the atmosphere. Makes sense? The level of CO2 would thus increase at a lower rate than many experts have predicted. So overall, you see it's a balanced passage for now, because it talks about some research and it talks about experts. I really have not seen an explicit claim by the author here, right? Explicit claim by the author, no. One is saying that the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide will have doubled. It can contribute to global warming. However, some research is saying that CO2 fertilization eventually will decrease the rate of global warming. And now I hope you have realized why is the word however written there. Again, the whole paragraph, if we have to quickly summarize the paragraph, can I say anticipated doubling of atmospheric CO2? This was my first line. CO2's role in global warming. Second line, CO2 fertilization effect, and the fact that this would actually help us mitigate global warming, which is what some research was suggesting. Let's go to this particular paragraph. So it says, however, while a number of recent studies confirm that plant growth would be generally enhanced, this was the major scope of the second half of the first paragraph. They also suggest that increased CO2 would differentially increase the growth rate of different species of plants. So maybe it's one more advantage, which could eventually result in decreased agricultural yields. Now this is a disadvantage, right? Certain important crops such as corn and sugarcane that currently have higher photosynthetic efficiencies, the way to convert food, then other plants may lose that age in an atmosphere rich in CO2. So it says, okay, while I might agree that plant growth would be generally enhanced, we're also trying to say that increased CO2 would probably have different impact on different species of plant, and the overall agricultural yield might decrease. Patterson and Flint. Now I've always advised you, the moment you find these proper nouns coming in, ensure that you mention and keep this in mind, that who's being introduced and what is being spoken by him, have shown that these important crops may experience yield reductions because of the increased performance of certain weeds. So are we assuming that these certain weeds would compete for the same resources of these important crops? That's one. Maybe certain weeds could get more advantage with this increased CO2 than these important crops would get. Such differences in growth rates between plant species could also alter ecosystem stability. So very important point. Studies have shown that within rangeland regions, for example, now this is an example, if I've understood this line, I could quickly read this. A VD grass, this VD grass is from here, grows much better with plentiful CO2 because there is a CO2 fertilization than do 3 other grasses. That means this VD grass will outnumber 3 other grasses, and maybe that could be an example of altering ecosystem stability. Now because this VD grass predisposes land to burning, its potential increase, it's referred to what? VD grass. may lead to greater numbers of and more severe wildfires in future rangeland communities. So we are saying that there could be one type of plant, I could take an example, one type of plant defeating, what I would say, one type of plant defeating other plant or other plants. So my ecosystem stability is ordered, and with this particular example I'm also showing that there would be more severe wildfires. So this whole paragraph is about nothing but it's saying that okay, increased carbon dioxide might result in plant growth, but these plant growth is something that the author or the paragraph itself is not being very happy about. This is the most important tone that you can derive from this paragraph. Let's see if we are good with this analysis of the paragraph. Key ideas: different response to elevated CO2 with respect to plants, sugar cane and all that stuff. Potential decrease in agricultural yields. This looks like a good central idea of this paragraph to me. This in fact came down as a conclusion, so again pretty important idea, and then there is example which we kind of understood. Let's go to the next paragraph. So it says it is clear that CO2 fertilization effect, I'm very sure this is going to come in the main idea, does not guarantee the lush world of agricultural abundance that once seemed likely. We're talking about the second half of the first paragraph, and this looks like where the author is probably trying to show his perspective, and then he's raising a question. But what about the potential for the increased uptake of CO2 to decrease the rate of global warming? Do you remember this was also an advantage being mentioned? Some studies suggest that the changes accompanying global warming will not improve the ability of territorial ecosystems to absorb CO2. That means this advantage is also being weakened. Billing simulation of global warming conditions. Simulation. So here is an experiment coming in. In wet tundra grassland showed that the level of CO2 has actually increased. Plant growth did increase under these conditions because of warmer temperatures and increased CO2 levels. But as the permafrost melted, more peat, which is nothing but accumulated dead plant material, began to decompose. This process in turn liberated more CO2 rather than coming it down. It increased more. Billings estimated that if summer temperatures rose 4 degrees Celsius, the tundra would liberate 50% more CO2. Bad. In a warmer world, increased plant growth, which could absorb, would not compensate for this rapid increase. So he's agreeing plant growth did increase, but he's also talking about something which is being accompanied. So it is fine. He's saying that plant would increase, right? He's saying plant would increase, but you probably have not seen that more peat begins to decompose, and the rate of this decomposition liberating more CO2 would defeat something that the plants would observe. This observation is particularly important because high latitude habitats such as the tundra are expected to experience the greatest temperature increase. That means it's trying to say that even on the decrement of the rate of global warming, the increased CO2 or CO2 fertilization effect is not going to give me the result as the research in the first paragraph largely suggested to. So now let's look at the summary of this particular paragraph. Can I say response of tundra grasslands to warming? This was majorly about habitat, and if you see, this was about Billings, and there were two other scientists being mentioned around in the previous paragraph. Acceleration of decomposition rates, net increase in atmospheric CO2 level, plants would absorb, but the peat would emanate more than what the plants would absorb, right? And implications for high latitude habitats. Now let's go to this particular paragraph, which for me is one of the most important paragraphs. So can I say paragraph number 1 was introduction, right? And this introduction was nothing but it said that CO2 would double. This was being stated, correct? And then there was a research which probably put out that increased CO2 would eventually decrease global warming, right? And then this particular fact was being negated, was being counted in the subsequent paragraph. So differential responses to elevated CO2, impact of global warming on terrestrial ecosystems, habitat, with a major focus on habitat. In summary, the passage examines the multifaceted relationship between elevated CO2 levels, agreed, plant growth, which was the second paragraph, global warming, and its intent is to highlight the what? The complexities and potential consequences of these interactions on ecosystems and climate dynamics. I think this one line is something which I believe is one of the most important lines for you to take out from the paragraph. Initially, it might find a little difficulty to come out with these lines, but with practice and all of that, I'm sure if you pick the right set of keywords with the right set of tone and not think too much beyond what is evidenced, you should be able to find this. Let's go to the first question. A question that you would almost always find on CAT: which of the following best states the main point of the passage? So let's look at this. Recent studies have yielded contradictory findings about the benefits of increased levels of CO2 and agricultural productivity. I really don't think so. This was as specific as this option puts out to. So if nothing else, I would say, isn't the word agricultural productivity making this option very specific? We have to probably talk about terrestrial, and I think mostly the paragraph was trying to show, trying to refute the research which stated the benefit of CO2 fertilization effect. So I'm probably trying to find that line is something I'm not very happy about. The possible beneficial effects of increased levels of CO2 on plant growth and global warming have been overstated, right? Because this is where paragraph number 2 and paragraph number 3 were bringing on those evidences that they've been overstated, and the paragraph kind of tried to prove this, an option that I would so comfortably keep on hold. Increased levels of CO2 would enhance the growth rate of certain plants, maybe about wheat, but would inhibit the growth rates of other plants. Maybe we're talking about sugarcane. True, maybe true, but not the main idea. It was probably an example which was being stated and only about the second paragraph, right? Increased levels of CO2 would increase plant growth, okay, but the rate of global warming would ultimately increase. Probably he is trying to say that it would increase plant growth, but not all plant growth, right? Overall, the impact on plant would depend on the types of plant. And option number D doesn't say that. Doesn't it sound like very general from this part of the option? And because it says too general, the paragraph clearly says that different plant would have different growth. D is also eliminated. The final answer here is option number B. So I think option number D was brilliantly framed. C becomes a little too specific to the example in the in one of the given paragraphs, and a perfect trap for your CAT RC practice. But I hope you've gotten the answer as Bombay. Let's look at this particular question. The passage suggests that the hypothesis mentioned in the first paragraph is not entirely accurate because it fails to take into account which one of the following in predicting the effects of increased vegetation. Correct? Increased vegetation on the rate of global warming. Fair enough. We're talking about hypothesis mentioned in the first paragraph. So we need to talk about the hypothesis mentioned that maybe CO2 fertilization effect will be advantageous as compared to the disadvantage that the world has been feeling. And then we go on to the example about vegetation and global warming. Plant increase, probably global warming will not decrease as much as it was being stated out. Increased levels of CO2 will increase the photosynthetic rates of many species of plants. Not really, correct? Increased plant growth, this is probably not the idea which is being implied here, right? Because we have to talk about because it fails to take into account. This in fact was written because I think this was being written, so I could say this is being taken into account. Increased plant growth cannot compensate for increased rates of decomposition caused by warmer temperatures. I think this makes sense. This was not being taken into account because it was saying, okay, I am good. But the continuous paragraph said you're not as good, you're making it out to be because you probably have not taken this. The sentence around peat and all. So isn't this an option that the hypothesis is failing to take into account for? So I would keep this option on hold and I would remove this option. Increased levels of CO2 will change patterns of plant growth and thus will alter the distribution of peat. I think the ecosystem would have made sense here. This is eliminated. Increase in vegetation can be counted on to draw more CO2 from the atmosphere. Probably yes, that means this was being taken into account and not fail. The correct answer here would be option number B. I like the option framing though. Honestly, I like the option framing. Let's go to this one. Which one of the following best describes the function of the last paragraph? This was being used with a lot of examples around vegetation, Tundra, to negate the hypothesis that was predominantly a part of the first paragraph. Critical reasoning skills come into picture, guys. Boldface critical reasoning. It presents research that may undermine a hypothesis present in the first paragraph. I predicted this almost 5 seconds back. So I'll keep this option on hold. It provides an additional explanation for a phenomenon described in the first paragraph. No, it's countering it. So additional explanation won't make sense. B is eliminated. It provides experimental data in support of a theory described in the preceding paragraph. No, I think the second paragraph and the third paragraph were bringing in different evidences and they were not as strongly correlated as option number C is making it out to be. Eliminated. It raises a question that may cast doubt on information. Okay. Presented. Okay. In the preceding paragraph? No. It was the paragraph preceding the preceding paragraph, right? It was there in the first paragraph. So D is also eliminated. The correct answer is option number A. Let's go to the last question for the day today. According to the passage, Billings research addresses. Billing, I think, was about the third paragraph. It was about, if I had to find out habitat, Tundra and all of this stuff, right? Tundra probably would face more because the increment of CO2 is probably the highest there. What kind of habitat will experience the greatest temperature increase in an atmospheric high in CO2? Okay, maybe. But he was just saying Tundra. He was not focused on what kind of habitat will experience. He just said Tundra will. He was not trying to evaluate it. But in a very practical word, I would be confused with this option. I would keep this on hold. I'll show you the trickiness here. Will enhanced plant growth necessarily decrease the rate of global warming that has been predicted by experts? Wasn't this slightly the more evidence and the general discussion around Billings research? It was not about kind of habitat, if you remember. It was all about finding whether an enhanced plant growth would help you decrease the rate of global warming. And he said probably not as much as the first theory made it out to be. Now option number B goes on hold and I eliminate option number A because this was not the central idea of the Billings research. Would plant growth be differentially enhanced? Not really, but I'll read this option. I've always advised you to read the option completely. If atmospheric concentrations of CO2 were to double by the end. This is first paragraph, first line. Unnecessarily what he's doing is he's picking some words from the first paragraph, first line. Unnecessarily picking some words from the question in context and adding up randomly. Anyway, I'm happy about B. Does P decompose more rapidly in wet tundra than it does in other types of habitats? I probably did not talk about other types of habitats. Again, also the research was not about P decomposing where and where not. D is also eliminated. The final answer here is option number B. Perfect. I hope the passage again was good. I have been constantly troubled on a personal note by a passage that is slightly biological and has a lot of information. But I probably thought that this was doable if you could pick up the right set of words. And I'll probably try to bring in more passages by day after tomorrow and we'll try to be a little more regular. And I'll see you guys in the next session. Thank you very much.